What is a tariff?
Well, in the most basic sense, a tariff is a tax. It is a tax that is levied upon products that are being imported into a country. So, for example, if say Ecuador is sending coffee to the United States, the U.S. could levy a 10% tariff on that coffee. So you take the price of the coffee and add 10% to it, and the government collects that as a tax. So that's it in a nutshell. It is literally just a tax.
So then, if it's a tax on products that are coming into the country, then why is that? Why would a country charge a tax? Because I know that a lot of the talk is about U.S. tariffs being raised on a variety of countries, but of course, there's lots of countries that have their own tariffs on each other's products and on U.S. products. So what's the goal there?
Well, the rationale for tariffs there are a couple of them. In one sense, they can just be simply a revenue generator for the government. In fact, the United States, for the early part of its history, that's how it funded the federal government. It was through tariffs and those types of taxes. But today, tariffs are used more as kind of an economic tool to protect generally specific domestic industries. So, you know, let's say that the U.S. wants to protect its steel industry. We've got lower price steel coming in from China. Well, by levying a tariff on that cheaper steel, it raises the price of the foreign steel, and allows the domestic steel that's more expensive to remain competitive with the steel that's coming in from the other countries. So it's kind of used to, uh, let's say, balance out the trade, but really the purpose of it is to protect domestic industries and domestic producers.
So, for folks who saw the thumbnail for tonight's episode, I had the picture of Trump holding that big chart that I'm sure everybody's seen. That is, here's tariffs that the U.S. currently levies, and then here's the percentages on tariffs that other countries then levy on the U.S. And to be sure, a lot of those foreign tariffs are higher than the tariffs that the U.S. had levied, and then therefore here is the final section of the chart is, well, this is how much we're going to raise the tariffs. It's been referred to as reciprocal tariffs, not reciprocal in the sense that it's, oh, you're 50, we're going to be 50. The numbers were kind of all over the place, and so since they were, I want to ask you about that. Let's talk about the Trump tariffs. So first of all, in the same sense that I asked you, well, what is a tariff? Well, what specifically are people referring to when they talk about the Trump tariffs? What are the Trump tariffs? It's kind of like the who, what, where, when, why, right? What are the Trump tariffs, and why are they? How did they, when you see that chart and you see that, well, it was 20, but they're 50, so now we're 37.6. How did they come up with this chart to determine how they were going to raise tariffs on all of these nations all around the world?
Well, it's not honestly completely clear. Like they haven't put out any fact sheet that says we determined the tariff rates using this formula. People have kind of tried to reverse engineer it, and they
Mm-hmm.
figured out that in effect what the US has done is they've taken the trade imbalance and they've used that in an equation to determine a tariff amount. So, let's take China for example, and let's say that our trade deficit with them is $1 billion. In other words, they are exporting $1 billion more in products than we are exporting to them. So that's the trade imbalance. And so they use that in a formula to determine, well, then we need to levy this much of a tariff in order to make that even. That's where they're coming up with this idea of it being reciprocal. The thing that's weird about it, though, is I've never ever until this moment, well, not this very moment, but when this all came out, I'd never seen anybody calculate tariffs in that way. Tariffs are applied generally on an industry specific basis. So, for instance, I know that Canada imposes a very high tariff on uh, wood lumber that is imported from the US into Canada to protect Canadian lumber industry. But that
Sure.
doesn't mean that everything that the US imports into Canada is at that same tariff rate. So tariffs are generally industry specific. So you might have a really high tariff on one specific thing and then very low tariffs on other products that are coming in. So this is a really, I mean, just to be honest about it, it's a really strange way to try to calculate tariffs. And it seems like what they're trying to do is they're trying to figure out a way to minimize this trade imbalance, to have more products being exported out of the US and less products being imported so that that trade balance that the US runs on a regular basis is smaller or eliminated.
Well, let's since you brought up that term, we'll get to that in just a moment. I feel like I kind of want to add here that you brought up that a lot of these tariffs are just country charges this, we're going to charge that, but typically you think of tariffs on an industry by industry base. You use Canada and lumber as a perfect example.
Mhm.
Um, uh, I feel like this is a good time for people in the audience that are not familiar to know what the term comparative advantage means. That even if your country is full of incredibly skilled workers that have infinity resources at their disposal, there's going to be things that they can make. Even if they made everything better, if country A still made everything better than country B, but they make certain things way better than country B, but country B can make some things close to as good, it just stands to reason that you would use your production on the things that are going to help both countries the most and not worry so much about the other things. You can get the widgets anywhere, right? Um, and in some sense, maybe because we're kind of delving into the area of protectionism, right? And we've
Mhm.
already kind of brought up the idea of manufacturing and all that. But before we get into the manufacturing side of the argument, let's talk a little bit more about this whole trade deficit thing. I think that the layman, just hearing the news and reading the article, and particularly hearing the administration talking about, well, we're trying to impose these tariffs because we're trying to accomplish some type of balance in fair trade, and our trade deficit with all of these nations is so significant. But when you see, trade deficit negative $1 trillion, that doesn't actually mean you lost $1 trillion, right? That doesn't mean that, oh, we lost a trillion. We just added $1 trillion to the deficit because we spent more money. So what does trade deficit really mean? And is that actually a bad thing necessarily or otherwise?
Yeah, not necessarily. I think the easiest way to kind of explain it is to make it into a personal example. So today, on my way home from playing hockey, I stopped at Publix and I spent $35 at Publix buying a few groceries that we needed. And Publix has not sent me anything. Well, they gave me those products, but they've not bought anything from me, right? So I'm a writer. Publix has not ever once said, "Hey, Mike, we need you to write something for us." So I run a constant, massive trade deficit with Publix. I get all kinds of products that are imported into my home from Publix. Publix imports nothing from the Meharries. So that is a trade deficit. Now, am I worse off because of that trade deficit? No, of course not, because my refrigerator is full of food and I like to eat. So it's not necessarily a bad thing for there to be a trade deficit, especially when you consider, as you were mentioning, comparative advantage, right? Um, a country that's very poor may not, the U.S. manufactures a lot of high tech things. We manufacture things like airplanes. Well, Ecuador is not going to buy an airplane. That's just how it is. They're going to send us coffee, which is great, but that trade deficit is not necessarily a net loss for the United States. There are problems with trade deficits, especially the way that the U.S. runs them, in the sense that um, it we are sending a lot of money overseas. And if the world ever decides it doesn't need those dollars anymore, then the US is in trouble. But the fact of the matter is, the US trade deficit has benefited the United States government tremendously because it allows the government to borrow and spend far more than it otherwise would. So the fact that, Social Security is as solvent as it is, which isn't very, but at least some, is partly due to the fact that the US sends a lot of dollars overseas and it keeps our inflation at bay. So there are advantages and disadvantages to having a trade deficit. It's not necessarily, oh my gosh, this is a bad thing.
Well, before we move on, kind of our own our own feelings or judgments on whether or not the tariffs are a good idea. Let's talking about the what are they trying to accomplish. I feel like it can, in a lot of ways, it can be broken down into there's two areas that are triggers for the public at large and their support. There's the domestic manufacturing, right? It's made in USA. Everything's supposed to be made in USA. All the official MAGA caps and hats all have the made in USA sticker. But hey, if that's important to you, then more power to you. But then, of course, there's also you brought this up early on when you were just describing what tariffs are, is that there was a time in our nation's history that tariffs funded the federal government. And of course, as we're talking here, it's the going into the second week of April, so it's coming around to tax time. So who wouldn't want to have their taxes lowered, if not eliminated completely, and let the federal government figure out other ways to fund itself? It's not out of your in my pocket, which, hey, that sounds perfectly good to me. So let's do these one at a time. So manufacturing, we're gonna raise tariffs because we're gonna use the bully, the club that is the exchange, in order to force manufacturing back to the United States. I feel like the term that everyone's using now is reshoring. All of this manufacturing that has gone overseas we're decades, of course, at this point. We're going to bring all that manufacturing back, which is going to, of course, create jobs, and everything's going to be made in the United States. Is that a worthwhile goal, or is that a bad idea?
Well, it depends on who you are, which I think is true of a lot of economic calculations, right? If you are a person in the steel industry, absolutely, you want to bring steel manufacturing back to the United States. You want to have more steel worker jobs, and people who do those jobs would certainly benefit from more steel business being done right here in the good old US of A. But it necessarily raises the price of steel. That's the whole point of the tariff. It's to raise the price of less expensive, in our example here, steel that's coming from overseas, so that it is competitive, or that so that US steel is competitive with the foreign steel, to make kind of their prices equal out, and then people can buy domestic. But the overall impact of that is that steel is overall more expensive. And so, you know, Joe car manufacturer is not going to be real keen on this, because all of a sudden he can't get this cheaper steel, this cheaper input to build his automobile. It's going to cost him more money. So there are always winners and losers anytime you start making these type of economic calculations. So it's really impossible to say that, it's necessarily beneficial overall to bring manufacturing back on shore. There are reasons that a lot of manufacturing has moved overseas. And insofar as those were legitimate reasons, to artificially try to block that and bring that manufacturing back to the US is going to cause a lot of unforeseen and unseen consequences. And as the great economist Bastiat once said, a good economist not only considers the seen, the fact that we now have more steel manufacturing in the US, but it also considers the unseen impacts, which would be the fact that steel is now overall more expensive, and that's hurting other people.
I think one thing to kind of make clear for people, because when people hear, oh, we've lost manufacturing, it's gone overseas, we need to bring it back. The actual manufacturing output of the United States has not tanked. In fact, the efficiency of modern manufacturing in the United States is higher than it's ever been. But it is true that perhaps we have lost jobs. Absolutely, there have been jobs that has gone overseas. But sure. I feel like it's not just because there's more than one reason for anything. That's why economics is tough to wrangle with. But it's not just prices, right? It's also tech. When you make a forklift, some guys that are carrying boxes around are going to lose their job because the forklift can carry a lot of boxes, right? So you extrapolate that over decades and decades and decades, and robots and AI and all sorts of things. But I think one of the big areas of disconnect is that on the surface level, people feel like losing jobs equals bad. And therefore, we want more jobs. We want unemployment down and jobs up. But the jobs that have left that also weren't already just replaced by technological advances have been replaced because it's cheaper to import those products from overseas. You hear people complain of, oh, China has sweatshops and people working for pennies on the dollar to sew your probably the suit, to be honest with you, and therefore the price of that suit is cheaper than if someone had made it here. So, but
Right.
but that brings us around. But that's an interesting point, right? So now we're not talking about manufacturing; we're talking about jobs, and we're not even talking about jobs. We're talking about the price of the product and how much you can get paid doing the job, right? Which kind of raises the interesting question of if the jobs that went overseas because those products can be imported at pennies on the dollar, and people working here making those same products would want 20, 30, $40 an hour to work in the mill versus someone overseas working for adjusted to US a couple of bucks. Do you think that's what people really want when they say that they want to bring back manufacturing? Do people want to go work on the line for pennies on the dollar?
I think that they personally don't. It's kind of the same argument with the immigrants who are taking our jobs, right? They think about that, but they're not going to go in the field and pick strawberries. But I think they imagine that there is this whole field of people out there who are just clamoring to go work in the Nike shop and sew shoes. And I kind of doubt that, but that's kind of the way the thinking is. I think when people think we're going to bring manufacturing back to the United States, they imagine that, it's going to be these $50 an hour assembly line jobs that are really complicated, and that's not what it is. I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what types of jobs we're even talking about here. And I think you're alluding to something that's absolutely correct. Most Americans are not going to be willing to do those jobs, certainly not at the pay rates that somebody in China
Mm-hmm.
or Bangladesh or somewhere else is willing to do those things because their standard of living is lower. And so, in effect, I think a lot of people what they're wanting is they're wanting the tariff so that they can somehow subsidize our standard of living, and it just doesn't work that way. And again, some people will benefit. We talk anytime you talk about people losing jobs, that's bad for the people that lose jobs. And I don't want to gloss over that. I don't want to make light of people that have lost their jobs, but it is part of the creative destruction that is inherent in any economy. You think about when automobiles started to be produced, the buggy whip manufacturer, that's a typical example that's used in economic textbooks. They didn't need buggy whips anymore. So the buggy whip factories closed and the buggy whip producers lost their jobs. But that creative destruction in the long run opened the door for a whole new set of jobs and a whole new set of industries to grow and build. So there's a constant destruction and creation in the economy that has to be allowed to play out um, in order for you know overall humanity to advance.
Well, okay, we've talked about the manufacturing side of things, and let's talk about the funding side of things. So if you raise tariffs, then that means in theory you're going to have greater revenue because you're charging more for imports. And you had already mentioned this, and boy, don't we know President Trump is really quick to tell everyone that before the early 20th century, I mean, the nation was largely funded by tariffs. Of course, he's glossing over the fact that when you say, like, if you happen to pick a year, like, I don't know, like a 1913 somewhere, you're talking about the income tax. Let's call it what it is. It's sort of this implicit suggestion that if we raise more revenue with tariffs, and it's fair because countries have been charging us tariffs for years and years and years. Therefore, we will be able to lower taxes, if not eliminate the income tax. It seems like that's an easy sell, right? Who wouldn't like to hear the politician say, "I'm going to charge the nameless, faceless person overseas more money, and now you don't have to pay taxes this year"? Sure, I'd vote for that guy. Why not?
Yay!
So
Right.
so so why is that a bad idea? Tariffs in, income tax out. Why doesn't that work?
Well, I want to hit on kind of 3 points in this. The first point is that you're talking about two rationales for tariffs that are at odds fundamentally, right? On the one hand, we're going to use tariffs to protect domestic industry, to limit imports so that domestic production can flourish. So if we're minimizing imports, that means tariff revenue is going to, in essence, go down over time, right? The idea is that the tariffs eventually don't matter because we're building all of this stuff and producing all of this stuff in the United States. So therefore, you're not going to raise nearly the amount of revenue on tariffs in 5 years as you are today. So it's almost kind of these two things are working at odds with each other. The second thing that I think is important to understand is that when the United States was funding the government with tariffs, the government was much, much, much smaller than it is today. There is no way that the United States can fund all of the borrowing and the spending and all of the government that we have today, all of the wars, the warfare and welfare state on tariffs alone. And so I wish I had kept the link, and I've lost it along the way, but somebody actually ran the numbers and kind of determined what the tariff rates would have to be in order to replace the income tax funding. And it was somewhere in the neighborhood of, I want to say it was like 110%, something crazy like that. That would
Hmm.
be totally unreasonable. So it's not a thing. And then the third point that I think people need to keep in mind is that there are political realities here. The politicians are going to tell you, yeah, we're going to have tariffs and we're going to get rid of the income tax, which I think a lot of people would be for. But when reality plays out, what you're going to end up with is tariffs and an income tax because they ain't getting rid of the income tax, you know. And maybe I'm being cynical, but I have about 250 years of government history that shows that once these taxes and programs are in place, they don't ever go away. They just add to them. You know, it's the ratchet effect that was so brilliantly explained by economist Robert Higgs. You know, everything the government does, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger over time. So to think that you're going to somehow replace the income tax with tariffs, I think is at best wishful thinking.
I think it's interesting that the same people, both in the administration and the people who support the administration, who would try to sell you on these talking points that look at the positives that we're trying to affect via these tariffs, as opposed to accentuating on the reasons why we haven't had the tariffs before or haven't had them larger. It's kind of like taking things to ad absurdum, right? Well, why don't we just have 1,000% tariff on everything? I mean, boom,
Right.
there you go. We've solved everything.
Yeah.
But as you kind of already alluded to, is that so often we see it's not we're going to change A for B. We're gonna have A and B. We're gonna have
Mhm.
the income tax and we're gonna have high tariffs. But let's just say, just playing devil's advocate, even if the idea is that, well, we'll cut government spending, right? Well, we'll try to meet. We're going to meet halfway. We're going to take a little bit of their policy. We're going to take a little bit of our policy. We're going to meet halfway. We're gonna raise tariffs. We're going to try to generate more revenue without taxation, but we're also going to cut government spending, and then maybe we'll find somewhere in the middle where at least your tax burden has lightened some, but tariffs have gone up some. But it's really hard to even give them the benefit of the doubt in that, right? Because we're what, just a few weeks removed from another budget crisis and another vote in Washington where they've, of course, talking about the recent continuing CR, where anyone that voted against it voted for more spending, voted for Joe Biden's budget from last year. They were threatened to be primaried because you didn't vote for more deficit spending. How dare you?
Right.
And
Right.
we're hearing in the news just this week of they're promising a new first time ever $1 trillion budget for the Pentagon. We're to believe that these people who want to fund the government entirely via tariffs, which would have to necessarily include cuts in government spending, why aren't they cutting spending first, even a little bit, even if it was even as kind of that idea of the 1% cut, right? I think Rand Paul has suggested that. How about we just have a 1% cut across the board, across every department, perhaps just as a show of good faith that, oh look, we're gonna tighten our belts on this, therefore give us a little bit of rope on these other economic policies. Sounds like a lot of wishful thinking, doesn't it?
Yeah. As you're talking, I was thinking back to the last uh, debt ceiling budget crisis that we had when Obama was in office, and they came up with this. I think they called it the Inflation Reduction Act, and when they rolled that out, there was all of these spending cuts in there that they talked about. We're cutting, billions here and billions there. And then you go and you actually look at the spending, and you can do that every month. The Treasury Department issues a Treasury statement. You can go in there and look and see exactly how much money has come into the federal government and how much money has gone out. There weren't no spending cuts, not a one. We were spending nearly $500 billion every single month uh, before the Inflation Reduction Act, and then in the latter part of the Biden administration, it went up to like 600 billion a month. So it just doesn't happen. And I think part of it, again, it's political. Everybody likes the idea of spending cuts in theory, but nobody wants their program cut, right? Republicans don't want to cut defense. The Democrats don't want to cut the welfare state, and I'm using kind of stereotypical terms there, but there's always something that, well, we need to fund this fully, we need to fund this more, and that's just the nature of politics. And then you get into the negotiation, and then nobody cuts anything. And there's also this crazy thing in government that they call baseline budgeting. And they'll actually, they build in, okay, we're going to increase this budget, this department's budget by 5% every year. And then 2 years down the road, they'll go, you know what, we're only going to increase this 3% this year. And then they'll call that a spending cut. Well, it's not a spending cut. They've increased the spending 3%. The only cut is they didn't extend it as much as they said they were to begin with. So anytime the government starts talking about cutting spending, my eyes just gloss over because it just doesn't ever happen. Could it happen? Sure. And I could grow a horn out of the front of my head right here on air, and it would be really cool, but probably not going to happen.
We'd have higher ratings, at least that.
We
Well,
would.
okay, so we've talked about what we're dealing with, and what they're trying to accomplish, but versus what we feel like the realities of the likelihood of those things being very generous in our interpretation of what their activity is. But let's get into it then. Kind of moving on to why are they retarded? As I put as bullet point number 3. So if
Yes.
we have centuries of economic data that suggests that this just isn't going to fly, I mean, and that's putting it quite mildly, then why even make the attempt? What could they be doing differently or better? And maybe more importantly, why are people buying into this? I mean, if it is so self-evident that these policies are not going to succeed, then how come it is that so much of the public at large are buying into it?
I think part of it is just it's a really good sales job. And I think there's a lot of frustration out there. There's a lot of people that they look at their own lives and they see that the dollars that they bring home every month doesn't buy nearly as much as it did a year ago or 2 years ago. They see that their own life is getting more and more difficult. So they're looking for, I mean, just to be blunt, they're looking for a savior. They're looking for a messiah. They're looking for somebody who can come in and fix things. And you add to that, kind of the left wing, right wing political bias that's just inherent in American politics. And you've got this guy, and he's come in and he's promised to do these radical things, and they've dressed it up in a new way. And we're going to make America great. And there's a lot of slogans. And I think that excites people, and just it gives them this modicum of hope. And, it's the same thing as we've seen on the left. They keep rolling out the same stupid socialist ideas over and over again. And it's this mentality, we're going to make it work this time. This time it'll work because we're going to do it different. Our central planners are smarter and better than the old central planners. So we're going to get this done. And I really think I really think that that's somewhat of what's going on. I think there are a lot of people who honestly believe, for whatever psychological reasons they're going on, that Trump central planners, they're going to get it right this time. They've got it down. And so we need to trust him because he's brilliant and he's a great businessman and he owns the libs on Twitter.
It's funny that you mention it from kind of the political angle, because I know that I know you've seen this as well, a lot of MAGA accounts, a lot of right-wing, self-described right-wing influencers that have recently been sharing old clips of, Nancy Pelosi in the early 2000s and Barack Obama in the 20 teens arguing in favor of higher tariffs, and they're sharing this as proof that Trump is right rather than proof that Trump is wrong, even though those are people that are synonymous with the political side of the aisle that they consider to be incorrect. I can't square that circle.
I can't either. And there's so many things that just don't make sense if you are a person who is holding to some kind of fundamental principle, right? I'm a free market guy. That's a fundamental principle that I operate out of. If something is happening that conflicts with that principle, even if it's people I like, the principle is always going to trump the personality and the policy for me. The only conclusion that I can draw is that there are a lot of people who don't really operate out of any real principle. They want to win. And I think that there's a lot
Sure.
of people on the right, and I understand this. I'm not, I don't mean to be condescending or to put people down. I think they're tired of losing. And I think they see in Trump a personality, a strong personality, a person who's going to take control, who's going to wield power in a way that will maybe help us win for once, right? Because again, and I said this kind of in a farcical way, but I think this is a big appeal to a lot of people. Trump owns the libs and they love it. And so therefore, if he can own the libs, then therefore his policies must therefore be good. I mean, it's the best we got. So maybe we can win. And to me, it's very short sighted because I think all of this executive power that is being wielded to such celebration. But, back up and think about this a minute. If Nancy Pelosi was proposing these same policies based on the same arguments, that we have an economic emergency and there's emergency powers and we have to give the executive all of this
Sure.
authority to do all the, they would be throwing a fit and they would be waving the Constitution and talking about, oh, this is unconstitutional. Not a peep. Now, in 2, 3 years, when a lefty is back in office, they'll all come back to the Constitution and start whining about the abuse of government power. But again, to circle back, I really think that a lot of it is people are tired of losing, and they see this as maybe, just maybe, an opportunity to win.
Well, you hit on a couple of things there that I definitely agree with, is because you and I had talked previously about, all the data would seem to suggest these are not well thought out policies. And again, I'm being really generous here. But you're seeing arguments being made in favor, from all the different parts of the political spectrum, right? You're seeing left wingers who were for tariffs who are saying, sure, hey, if you wanna enact our policies for us, go right ahead. But you're seeing right wing people that yesterday had Reed Rothbard, Reed Mises in their bios, who today are advocating for policies that obviously they haven't read, those people that they that they claim to have read. And I feel like that a lot of their arguments ultimately can be classified into two different groups. There's the 4D chess theory, right? So someone really ought to just write a political guide for this specific thing, the 4D chess theory.
Yeah.
And I sum it up as, Trump knows better than everyone else. That's the first assumption. And so that's why, if it seems like he's pursuing irrational policies that on the surface, or at least in the short term, seem to be harmful to Americans, they're actually going to be beneficial given a long enough view and perspective, because you're looking at the ball here, but he's actually working on change over here. It kind of like that diplomatic idea of, well, I'm going to bully you with tariffs, then you're going to enact changes in your country that Americans would benefit from, and now we'll reduce the tariffs. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that, look, there have been instances of that happening. The United States is a big country and it's very wealthy comparative to practically almost the entire rest of the world, right? So you can understand where throwing your weight around a little could be used to be a winner instead of a loser. And the other side, the other way it could be categorized is, it's sort of like bringing up the old economic fixed pie fallacy writ large. It's that
Mhm.
they all believe, all decisions must necessarily have winners and losers. You can't have decisions where everybody wins one way or another. That doesn't exist. In the same way that it's like they're bits of truth, but they're going the wrong way. In the very beginning of the show, you said, well, tariffs are a tax. Well, taxes necessarily are going to establish the winner group and everyone else who's paying as a loser group. And so I think the layman sees that. So they see half of your economic analysis and they say, well, in that case, if there's going to be winners and losers, then we're going to be the winners and they're going to be the losers, right? It kind of comes down to, I want to sum it with this, and I want to give you the final thought because we're running out of time. I think, Mike, that one of the most powerful arguments that can be made to anyone, big or small, a group or an individual, is what's fair, right? That resonates, I think, with with me, with everybody. Things
Right.
ought to be fair, and they have been convinced that actors around the world haven't been fair to us. Other countries have enacted policies that have made life lesser for you and me, and that wasn't fair because we weren't doing that to them. And so all of these policies, the Trump tariffs, kind of the diplomatic bullying, we're going to threaten you with X, and then you're going to change your policies domestically. Sort of like giving the U.S. government, a vote in your parliament all of a sudden. But that's okay. It's okay for us to be bullies because that's going to make things fair. And I can't help but think that people think that this is different. People think that Trump is different. This is all a novel approach, but nothing's new under the sun, as they
Right.
say. These things have been tried before. Um, and furthermore, I would conclude with this: what's fair? Nothing's fair. Who determines what's fair, as Milton
Exactly.
Friedman used to talk about? And if we were going to try to be gods ourselves and determine what is fair and whose share of what is and isn't fair and who's gonna enforce what is fair, I can tell you that there is no power on God's green earth that is less fair to you than the United States government. That
Yes.
cannot be your champion of fairness.
It's hard to add to that, but I want to make 3 points kind of in closing. The first was, as you were talking about fairness, I heard the voice of my dear mother, God rest her soul, echoing in my head, Michael, life's not fair. She used to say that all the time, and she's absolutely right. There is no fairness, right? For me, I believe strongly. I've built my entire, political worldview on the idea of that the fairest thing, the way we can get closest to fairness is through free markets and less government intervention. And I don't care who the central planner is. Central planners are always going to muck things up for the majority of people. Economics is an attempt, good economic policy is an attempt to bring the most people higher as possible. There are always going to be losers. That's just the nature of life. But when you start inserting government, you're going to have even more losers. And they're going to pick the winners, and they're not going to be the people that are around you. It's going to be their buddies. And just kind of as a final thought, I do believe that if the purpose of this is negotiation, that we're going to levy these taxes and we're going to force all of these other countries to their knees and to make concessions. And I'm hearing and reading that, all the phones ringing off the hook at the White House. People are wanting to negotiate now. That may work. But I was bullied when I was in middle school by this dude. And eventually I got bigger than him. He didn't bother me anymore. And I used to tell my kids all the time when my son and daughter were young. Daughter was older, and she used to pick on the younger one. I used to tell her, I would say, Sinead, Brendan's going to be bigger than you someday and stronger than you. You better watch it. And sure enough, the time came when he was able to turn the tables on her. The world is evolving right now to a point where the U.S. is not going to have the strength and power to bully other countries. And other countries are going to remember. We've got so many things that are going on right now. We've got de-dollarization. We've got more and more countries that are getting away from the dollar. More and more countries that are using gold. We're seeing alternative payment systems to get the dollar out of the equation. We're seeing the rise of the BRICS economic bloc. There are all of these things. It's slow. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but the U.S. is very slowly losing its hegemony. And I think Americans should be very careful as they throw their weight around about the potential consequences down the road when China and Vietnam and the BRICS and Russia, quote unquote, grow up. Because it's not going to bode well for the United States. And I'll tell you this, if we get to the point where the world says we don't need your dollars, the U.S. is going to be in a huge problem. You think we have an inflation problem now? You wait until the money printing and stuff is going on without the world using up dollars. So I really think that that's kind of the warning. May work. We may be able to bully our way through for another decade or two, but it's not going to last forever. And I think people should be very careful with that.
Well, on that note, I'll keep it short. The next time somebody tries to convince you that you ought to trust the government to make things better, you just tell them, hey, if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor.